This week saw a rare moment of bipartisan agreement in Washington. On Wednesday, the House of Representatives voted decisively to pass legislation that could lead to a ban of the popular app TikTok in the United States. That is, unless the Chinese parent company, ByteDance, agrees to sell the social media platform. The concern centers around the Chinese government's potential access to sensitive data on the app's 170 million American users. While the bill now faces an uncertain path in the Senate, President Biden has said he would sign it if it gets to his desk. A spokesperson for the Chinese Foreign Ministry called a potential TikTok ban an act of bullying. Let me bring in our experts. Kori Schake is the Director of Foreign and Defense Policy Studies at the American Enterprise Institute, and Glenn Gerstell is the former General Counsel at the National Security Agency. Kori, let me ask you, there's sort of two basic arguments that are made by proponents of this ban or this legislation, and I understand you are one of them, which is, one is the access to data, and the second is the potential for misinformation or disinformation. So why don't you explain both your concerns on those fronts?
Sure. I really appreciate the way that you structured the introduction, though, by making clear that this isn't a ban on TikTok. It's a ban on having a major media platform in the United States and its 170 million users, subject to Chinese national security law, which requires companies owned in and operating in China to make their data available to the Chinese government. And ByteDance has used the access to the data to surveil journalists. And a former ByteDance executive has testified that they used it to surveil protesters in Hong Kong. So there's not only the possibility, we have the experience of the company using the data for nefarious surveillance of people the Chinese government disagrees with. And the second argument is the arrow going the other direction, which is the likelihood of Chinese companies subject to Chinese national security law using their access to the American platform to try and shape the information available to Americans, or even to mobilize Americans to political action. And we actually just had the experience of it this last week, where TikTok messaged its 170 million Americans, trying to persuade them to call their congressman. It identified their individual member of Congress and the phone number to try and get them to call and advocate against the passage of the legislation. I think those are both legitimate national security concerns.
Okay, Glenn, how would you respond to both those issues? There's the data collection and the misinformation.
Thanks. So there absolutely is a national security concern over TikTok. No one's saying there isn't. But there are other ways to solve the problem, and they require a little bit of nuance and complexity. And frankly, that's not something that Congress does well. We just had a representative from Texas the other day, earlier this week, say that a vote against this ban, a vote against the bill, was a vote in favor of the Chinese Communist Party. And that's the sort of rhetoric that inflames this issue and prevents us from getting to the right kind of more nuanced public policy choice here. There is a way of dealing with both the user data risk problem that was just mentioned, as well as the potential for disinformation, in a way that isn't going to cause other problems that are going to affect our national security and will still solve the problem. America looks good when we stand up for freedom of speech and don't ban various apps. That's something that China does. They ban this network, CNN, the New York Times, Google, et cetera. That's not something the U.S. does. We should be passing privacy legislation that would affect all user data, not just ones on TikTok, but Google, Facebook, you name it. There are a lot of other solutions we can engage in that would largely solve the problem and wouldn't have the downsides that a ban would.
So, Kori, how do you respond to that idea that if foreign governments are trying to get access to user data, they can buy the access, the data very easily from Facebook, from Twitter, from all kinds of social media apps. And in fact, there is evidence that the Russian government did do that in 2016. They didn't need TikTok.
I agree. Selling user data is something that we absolutely should look into as a policy question. But I'm a little bit nervous to have civil liberties advocates arguing that the answer needs to be a lot more censorship than a narrow control on a particular company that has a record of utilizing user data for surveillance purposes and for trying to mobilize Americans for political purposes.
And when you look at the issue of freedom of speech, Glenn, I mean, I assume what you're saying is, look, we do allow Russian state TV to be accessed by Americans. I can get Russian state TV and I can listen to Putin's propaganda. I can listen to the Chinese Communist Party. And that's part of what we've always believed as Americans, that if there are ideas out there, even if the foreign government is sponsoring them, Americans should have the opportunity to listen to them.
Exactly right. You know, the Supreme Court said exactly that, which is that Americans have a First Amendment right to receive foreign propaganda, even if it's nonsense and wrong. That's just part of the picture we have with the First Amendment. And that's a really important freedom that we shouldn't lightly toss aside. And I'm not suggesting that a ban on TikTok would be tossing that aside, but it's a step toward banning a social media platform, something we've never done before. There are constitutional scholars who wonder whether this is really the right approach. We shouldn't be going down that road, given that there are other solutions at hand. And I'm all in favor of banning Chinese products. I was at the National Security Agency and saw firsthand China's maliciousness. I lived in Hong Kong for 8 years, so I know what they're capable of, and I'm not in any way suggesting we should be weak or soft or ignore this threat. We should and indeed are properly banning TikTok from government phones, from state phones. That makes sense. That's what Europe and Canada and the EU has done as well, but they haven't banned it totally, and neither should we.